This is the 6th iteration of TEFAF Coffee Talks, started in fall of 2016. I feel for some reason that it's kind of a big deal that it's now the 3rd spring iteration of this. We're still here. The program has grown from 5 coffee talks in the restaurant now to 10 talks, TEFAF Coffee Talks every morning at 11, and then TEFAF afternoons scheduled either 2 p.m. or 4 p.m. or sometimes both. So please check your brochure and see what else you might like to come to this week. We'd love to have you. I also want to let you know that the panels are live streamed on Facebook, and then they stay there for a while and go up on the website permanently. So if there's something about this that you would like to see again, use it as an educational resource, tap into it because of the great expertise of our panel. It's there for your enjoyment and your use. So we have an amazing story this morning. It's not that often that we get a narrative that includes a transformation from old to new, let's say. So in the season of spring and rebirth, we have a wonderful story about a painting and an artist, and that will form sort of the narrative of this panel, which is thrilling and exciting, and I'm so happy that TEFAF has been, in a sense, a little part of this story that you will now hear about on this panel. So I turn this over to Thomas Marks, editor of Apollo magazine, who's going to do the moderating for this panel. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much, Linda, and good morning, everybody. I am Tom Marks, editor of Apollo. We've got a wonderful panel here to talk about becoming Vincent all over again. I suspect we'll have a lot of arguments about how to pronounce Van Gogh this morning, or Van Gogh, Van Gogh, perhaps. So we'll see where we get to with that one. But if I say Van Gogh, I mean Van Gogh. On the panel this morning, we have Tom Lohman, not Lockman, the director of the Wadsworth Atheneum. He's been the director since 2016 and was previously at the Clark Art Institute in Massachusetts. We have Salvador Salort-Pons, who is the director of the Detroit Institute of Arts. Salvador has been at the museum since 2008, but the director since 2015. Is that right, Salvador? Right. And we have Martin Bailey. Martin Bailey, who many of you will know as one of the foremost experts in the world on Van Gogh. Martin has written more books than I can really list on Van Gogh, but recently books on the asylum at Saint-Rémy, and now coming out, I think it's about to come out, isn't it, your book on living with Vincent van Gogh?
Yes, last week, actually.
Just out, so head down to Barnes & Noble after this. He's curated exhibitions on the artist, and he's, in his role as a correspondent at the art newspaper, he now has a rather wonderful blog, Adventures with Van Gogh, which is regularly updated. But unfortunately, trying to read all the articles this morning, I came up against your new paywall, so I couldn't read all of them. Anyhow, I've asked all of the panelists to begin by picking one image that will in some way give us a sense of how Van Gogh is in a continual mode of reappraisal, and why in the last decade, perhaps, and in the last few years in particular, there's been so much interest in the artist. And we're going to kick off with Tom. I hope.
Well, maybe not. Anyway, in the top, there we are. I guess I'm here because I had the great fortune to be an art museum director at a time when Van Gogh studies were advancing to the point when some thorny authentication issues that have existed since the late 1980s could actually be sorted. On the screen, you see Vase with Poppies, which was painted probably in the month of June in 1886 in Paris by Vincent. I'll use Vincent because it's less political. Atop an older painting. And the painting was given to us by a marvelous collector as part of a bequest of 12 works, which included a beautiful Renoir of Monet painting in his garden in Argenteuil, a landscape pastel by Degas, a great Redon flower piece, and Monet water lilies from 1907. Yet it was not a picture that we particularly hung between 1957 and the late 80s. We were contacted by a PhD researcher at the University of Utrecht in the late 80s asking for a photo, and it read something like, "Please send me the picture of your fake Van Gogh," because this scholar had decided that the breakthrough of her research was going to be outing all the 1886 still lives as perhaps paintings made by imitators at the turn of the century. We took the picture down apparently in 1990 to get a hospital x-ray, and that showed a big blob under the painting. But what I hope we'll get into later this morning is how imaging technology came along, but more importantly, the scrutiny and the discipline that's happening at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam has allowed for a level of research and an understanding of each particular object that is truly exceptional.
You send a lot of paintings to hospital.
Do I send a lot of paintings to hospital? What a wonderful British thing to say. No, we didn't have our own X-ray machine in 1990. We now have a digital X-ray machine, a portable Xrf machine, and a infrared reflectogram machine in our lab, and that's due to the help of the Sherman Fairchild Foundation that does conservation equipment grants. And this was one of the first pictures we re-X-rayed with the new technology.
We will certainly come on to technical art history and Van Gogh studies. Salvador, your selection.
Absolutely, the self-portrait by Van Gogh of 1887. It is really not a painting that has ever been doubted. It's really an authentic Van Gogh, as you all know. But it's important for three things, just going beyond what Van Gogh is in terms of an artist. I think it's a symbol of the city of Detroit, especially in the last years when the city went bankrupt. And paintings like this one helped Detroit raise over $800 million of money that get the city of Detroit out of bankruptcy. So it was really the collection in many ways that saved Detroit. It's also very important because it's a painting that was bought in 1922, and it was bought by the city of Detroit. And that makes the DIA, the Detroit Institute of Arts, the first museum in America, the first encyclopedic museum in America to buy a painting by Van Gogh. It's also a very important painting because the museum, next year, the DIA is organizing an extraordinary exhibition called Van Gogh in America, in which the DIA is going to tell the story of how Americans and American museums collected Van Goghs in the 20th century. So it's just inspiring to see it in the galleries.
Well, I definitely think the reception history of Van Gogh and what you're doing, and just more generally this sense, it's part of what we're talking about this morning, how sustainable the excitement is about this artist almost. Martin, your selection, slightly different.
Yes, this might come as a bit of a surprise, but 2 weeks ago I went to Paris because I was going to write a blog about this particular gun. It's apparently the gun that Van Gogh used to commit suicide. It was dug up in a field in Auvers-sur-Oise in around 1960, but it's only recently emerged. And it was quite an emotional experience, really, to pick up the gun and put it in my hand. In New York, you're probably used to people with guns, but in London, it's slightly unusual. We don't often handle firearms. I was surprised how small it was. It really was small. But the reason I'm showing it to you is the link between Van Gogh, the person, and the art. And I think that is one of the reasons, possibly the most important reason, why Van Gogh or Vincent is such a popular artist. And it's very difficult to separate out the man from the work. And this gun, in a way, symbolizes the interest that there is in Van Gogh, the man. The gun is actually coming up for auction, I think it's the 19th of June, and I just hope that it's bought either by a museum or a serious collector and doesn't become a sort of rather gruesome trophy sent round the world, but we will have to see. And the other reason I'm showing you the gun is a question of provenance, which of course is very important if we're talking about authenticity. The gun has an estimate of 40 to 80,000 euros. I'm not quite sure how you value such an object. If it was just an ordinary gun, it probably wouldn't be worth 10 euros. So it's the provenance that gives it its value. And we know quite a lot about the circumstances in which it was found, so it's got a firm provenance. And likewise with the paintings, it's one of the elements to establish authenticity, but only one of the elements. But it is important to look at provenance, as we have with the recently reattributed Paris paintings. So that's why you're seeing this rather unusual image.
And Martin, do you think, I mean, ideally, would it go to Amsterdam, to the Van Gogh Museum, and be on permanent display there? Is that your feeling?
Well, I think it would be good to go into a museum. I think it really should be shown in a context. And the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam did show it once, a couple of years ago, when they had an exhibition on Vincent's mental health entitled Insanity. So I think it's very important that it's shown in a context rather than, as I say, some sort of gruesome trophy or relic.
Well, I think I'm going to flip away from the gun and back to Vase with Poppies, as it is a spring morning in New York, sort of.
Although we are in an armory.
Indeed we are. And I want to dive into some of these things that you've brought up with these images. And I think, Martin, I ask you to begin with, as someone who has spent so much time and work on researching the life of Van Gogh. What have you seen in the last decade? Is it true to say, as the premise of this panel more or less has it, that public and scholarly interest really has accelerated in recent years?
I think it has continually. I've been working on Van Gogh for sort of 30 years. And I mean, every year there is more and more interest. It becomes more and more difficult to borrow paintings and drawings for exhibitions. I curated an exhibition at the Barbican Art Gallery in the early 90s, and one could borrow things which are inconceivable, and even the great Tate can't borrow them today. And that's just one sign. There is an enormous amount of new research that's been done, really led by the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. And so we know so much more. We have the letters, which have now been a new edition, annotated and online. And there's enormous popular interest, and it's expanded geographically. So there's enormous interest in China, Korea, and there was in Japan some years ago. New areas where Van Gogh would have hardly been known a generation ago. So I really think every year he becomes more and more the popular artist. And possibly, you know, maybe the most popular artist in the world is certainly in the top half dozen.
So that means it's a bit of a coup for the Wadsworth Atheneum to discover a new Van Gogh in its collection.
Well, I mean, it's fraught. When the world began to reconsider or at least address the question of just what was Vincent doing in 1886 as he's putting away this idea of a dark, brooding interior that you might find with the potato eaters, and moving to Paris and trying to teach himself to paint with color and light. This picture, I think, was judged, circa 1990, based on a retrospective look at the artist. And they said, well, how could the painter of the sunflowers that sold for $114 million be the same author of a much more humble flower still life, painted maybe only a year earlier? So that was the great challenge. Now, for us, we didn't do it alone. The picture actually went back to storage and stuff in the late 80s. When I got to work at the Atheneum 3 years ago, it was hanging on the wall of the accounting office as just a decorative thing.
That's probably the most valuable picture in the collection.
and now it's one of the more valuable pictures.
Yeah, I'd be delighted.
There was great trepidation. Do we send it off to Amsterdam and let the Van Gogh Museum not only do the technical aspects, but But do a full provenance research, because that's where the documents now lie, at least in microfilm, if not digitally. Could we subject the painting to the same level of scrutiny of the world of Van Gogh, and then enable people here in the States and globally, because we do actually lend this picture. We'll be lending it to Salvador's project. We'll be lending it to a project in Potsdam this autumn, where they're bringing together all of these flower still lives from 1886, or at least about a dozen of them. So all that said, yes, it's been quite a phenomenon. We announced the findings of the Van Gogh Museum during TEFAF Maastricht. And Martin covered it in his blog. We simultaneously contacted the American press. And the story just, totally bounced around the world. Went out on the AP Wire, appeared in the New York Times, appeared in papers in Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, instantly. And the public interest in this, both on the internet and then physically in Connecticut, has been tremendous. The local paper told us that the story came out the same weekend as the Mueller report. And we had 3x the number of online hits on their site for this story than that. So it is a bit of a phenomenon. It's like riding a rocket.
We had a similar case in Detroit. It's not vase with poppies, it's vase with carnations. And when I arrived at the DIA, it was sitting in storage without a frame. So we had a similar process of looking at it in our hospital, our conservation lab with X-rays, infrared, and all the technical equipment. And then we sent it to Amsterdam, and they work on the painting as well. And basically gave us the authenticity for it. But we did a small exhibition called Faked Forgeries and Mysteries at the time. This was in 2009, where we had our vase with carnations together with another painting by Van Gogh showing a vase with flowers. And we had the visitors vote whether they believe our vase with carnation was authentic or not, just by comparison to the authentic one. And that was an interesting engagement activity that have the museum, in a way, prove that the visitors were also in agreement that the painting was by Van Gogh. One of the stories that we tell in the galleries is how these paintings, not changing at all, being what they are, have a hugely different value. If they are not Van Gogh, they are worth $700. But if they are, 70 million. And you always are in front of the same object.
Well, that's what their market value would be, I suppose. Martin, I mean, one thing for me that comes up from talking about especially these still lifes from the Paris period, is that perversity almost. With Van Gogh, we have essentially 10 years of production, 1880 to 1890? And there are so many stylistic shifts within that very intense career. Not someone who painted for 30 or 40 years. And yet it seems that there are areas of that 10 years that still, maybe the Paris period, Den Haag, the earlier time after Van Gogh had given up on being a preacher, that we still have things that we can find out about these paintings.
Yes, I mean, the Paris period is the most difficult period, really, for studying. And there's one simple reason that we have almost no letters from Van Gogh, because he was living with his brother Theo. So there's almost no letters, and the letters are very important for the other periods. The other important point is that Paris represented a transitional period. He'd been working in the Netherlands, where he'd been using dark colors, browns and grays, which were very much in vogue from the Hague school painters who did landscapes at that period. So Van Gogh came to Paris, and he was there for 2 years. He discovered the Impressionists, he discovered modern art, and it was a great period of transition. And that makes it more difficult and he went through various sort of periods, so he became interested in Neo-Impressionism for some months, and he worked in different styles, and that makes it very difficult to authenticate the pictures. So Paris is the most difficult period. And in a way, I think Flowers Still Lives are particularly difficult as a genre to determine the authenticity of. So it's a challenge. It's sort of the least known period of his life. And to think that he came from the dark colors of the Netherlands and then 2 years later, he was in Arles, in Provence, and doing these exuberant pictures. I mean, what transformation, but that shows that he was a genius.
Right. Well, Martin, I mean, there's a point of him being an outsider, too. In other words, he didn't do this in public, right? He's not pals with Gauguin and setting off for the South yet. How much do you think the fact that he was so not recognized as an artistic force has limited our ability to understand the Paris time?
Well, and we must remember that he was actually, although the public didn't recognize him, buyers didn't buy, he knew a lot of the avant-garde artists, and he moved in avant-garde circles, and he was about to begin to be recognized. So he wasn't a total unknown, which we sometimes assume he was. And the links that he had with these people was very important. So, you know, mixing with people like Gauguin, Pissarro, Signac, obviously had an important influence on him.
Can I just jump in? You mentioned the letters as well, Martin, and it probably is more a question for you again, but since that letters project of the correspondence going online, I think it's been online about 10 years. I mean, he is one of the artists of whom we have the most documentary evidence of his own hand, not least because he was such a good writer and a funny writer. How much has that, in that decade, have we changed what we've been able to see in the art?
Yes, I think the letters project was extremely important. Although the letters have been published in English since the 1920s, there are nearly 1,000 letters, and bringing them, first of all, they were translated to the very highest standards, so we have the best English translation. Secondly, they were annotated in enormous detail, so we now can see what the references are. And thirdly, they were published not only in book form but online, which makes them searchable, and that's terribly important with 1,000 letters, so you can search for a particular artist or a particular word. So I think it's increased our understanding and knowledge of the artist, and if anything, I think the conclusion has been that we now realize that Van Gogh was a much more intelligent man than the man in the street might think he was. I mean, the man in the street tends to think of him as a mad artist, going around sort of drinking and that sort of thing. But actually, he was highly intellectual. He read widely. In addition to Dutch, he read and spoke French, English, and German, which isn't bad at all. Much better than I can do. I think the letters really have given us a much better understanding of the man and his art.
I highly recommend the selected correspondence, the one volume, because it's just one of those books you can dip into and realize these sort of insights. As someone who writes about their painting and the things they're looking at, I think he's almost
unique. I mean, you don't find it in other artists, and that is the great advantage of studying Van Gogh, that the letters are incredible in terms of the information that we receive to understand his work. It's very difficult to think of another artist that left that kind of documentation.
Yes, and he writes about the paintings he's working on. So he says, "Oh, I've just finished this," you know, and then he describes the colours to his brother Theo. So there's an enormous content to them. It's a really rich resource.
Especially art historians, that we're always trying to get into the mind of the artist to see what is the creative process. He's providing that in his letters, helping us understand the importance of the works and what they mean.
It's almost like a diary.
It is. Yeah.
Let's move away from that part of the creative process, because I promised you on a Friday morning some technical art history. And I wanted to ask, I mean, Tom, why don't you lead on this one?
Sure.
Kind of with developments in technical art history, with what's happened with your painting, how far have new techniques, new machines for studying paintings and their conservation really changed how we think about Van Gogh?
Well, you know, I once heard a story about how the first use of the X-ray in the conservation lab happened up at Harvard in the 1930s. And I know that's true, but if you think about medical imaging and just how much each of us can go through a path of scrutiny, I think sometimes is indicative and sometimes just directional, right? So indicative telling you what's wrong, directional telling you what might not be wrong or what might be worth cutting into you or taking your blood or what have you. The same thing has happened, I think, with the application of those technologies in the conservation lab. I mentioned the Xrf machine, so that's an X-ray refractogram technology. Basically, you can touch it to a metal object, and it can tell you the metallurgy. What elemental components are in that alloy. And when you have a comprehensive study of certain things, that can be indicative of age or authenticity. So it's not like we have, we found fingerprints and we've printed Van Gogh's fingerprints. I know we did that with Leonardo, with David Bull at the Ginevra da Benci in Washington, but it's more directional. And so what the good people at the Van Gogh Museum were happy to get from us were these advanced imaging captures that could use an infrared reflectogram digitally on top of a digital X-ray and reveal that below this vase with poppies, upside down, was a painting of a bust. Oh. It was a human bust. You can clearly discern the curve of the ear, the bridge of the nose, the chin. And if you can imagine, the forehead of that figure is actually the vase. So, I can just imagine a frugal artist in the late 19th century flipping the painting over and saying, okay, well, now to do today's painting, I'll start again. Maybe I can reuse this without having to put too much more primer on to get started. They took the work we did and they brought it to a whole different level. And we've got a fine art history research library at the Atheneum, but nothing like the specificity of the Van Gogh Museum's access to archives and familiarity and fluency with the literature around prior ownership, exhibitions, etc. So, in sending the picture to them, they did do some crazy things, like map every thread in the linen support.
Right. That's important, yeah.
Because they're trying to build a corpus or a complete universe as possible of the canvases he was using at different times. So there's that technical art history thing, but there's also, they have access to the known dealers who were trading Van Gogh paintings. And so they quickly were able to determine that our painting was owned briefly by the famous dealer Leonardus, who was part of the great exporting of European modernism and European old masters to the United States. He owned it for a hot minute in 1898, but then you see it go through 6 dealers' hands in the span of about 4 years, and then come to America for the Armory show. Thank you, Salvador had found a photograph that depicts not only our other Van Gogh, the self-portrait we have from 1887, but 5 pictures away from it, Vase with Poppies. So having that complete dossier with all these different aspects, were strong enough to give an indication that this picture would be right.
And Salvador, obviously your exhibition will have, presumably quite a lot of provenance research and the story of the reception of Van Gogh, the narrative of Van Gogh in America, what he has represented. But will there be new granular research on the paintings for it as well?
There will be as well some technical analysis, and I know the curators are working on it, but the exhibition is going to be focusing on the image of Van Gogh in the United States. And believe it or not, when Van Gogh started to be known in America after the 1913 Armory show, he was not a preferred artist. It was not after the 1935 exhibition that MoMA traveled around the country, which was a solo exhibition for Van Gogh, where really the figure of the artist and the image that Americans had about Van Gogh started to develop. There was also a book written by Irving Stone, Lust for Life, that told us the biography of Van Gogh, and a movie was made after the book, I think with
Kirk Douglas.
Kirk Douglas playing Van Gogh. Yeah. And funny enough, the self-portrait of Detroit was used as the model to really characterize Kirk Douglas as Van Gogh. The producer of the movie, William Goetz, was a collector of Van Goghs. And he had some Van Goghs that were actually featured in the film, some of them in the collection of the DIA today.
If we have time, we'll come back onto versions of biopics of Van Gogh. But Martin, just on this technical art history point, Obviously, with various discoveries being made, quite a number in recent years, I mean, do you feel like now we have a stable sense of the Van Gogh corpus, or do you fully expect that we'll have more paintings being attributed to him and drawings attributed to him in the next decade as well?
Well, it's been quite an interesting process by which Van Goghs have been de-attributed and now are being re-attributed. And I think there's some interesting parallels with Rembrandt, actually. The Rembrandt corpus grew enormously over a century until the 1960s, and then the Rembrandt Research Project began and had a very narrow view of Rembrandt and narrowed down the oeuvre completely. And then since then, the pendulum has swung the other way. During the 1990s, there was a realization that there were a lot of fake Van Goghs, both in private collections and in museums as well. And we ran a story in the art newspaper that there were 45 fake Van Goghs around. And then I did a follow-up article actually for Apollo in 2005 and listed 34 Van Gogh drawings and paintings which were in museums, where the museums had either recently de-attributed them or had serious doubts. And since then, if you like, the pendulum has swung slightly the other way, and we're now looking more carefully and accepting some of them. And part of this is, as you say, because of the technical advances and the fact that we have infrared and X-ray equipment in a way that we didn't have in the 1990s. Great strides have been made. The Van Gogh Museum did a very good exhibition called Van Gogh at Work a few years ago about the technical advances, and we've mentioned this thread project, which sounds terribly dull, but is actually quite important in establishing whether the canvas, when the pictures were made and what role of canvas. So yes, I think the technical advances have made it much more possible to do serious work on whether pictures are should be reattributed, and those ones that are at the margin, like those that we've heard about, are the ones that are now being examined.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And the example of Vase with carnation at the DIA, it illustrates that point. In the 90s, it was considered a fake. We sent it to the Van Gogh. They said, we cannot demonstrate this painting is by Van Gogh. We had X-rays and infrared, and technology has been developed. But what has developed as well is the amount of information that we have now that you can benchmark and compare.
Yes.
Therefore, now we are not having only better equipment, but we have much more information with which we can analyze those results and make better judgment on
And the Van Gogh Museum is quite open. I mean, that data is open source, or the Letters project?
More or less.
Exactly. It leads me on to my next question, though, which is, obviously, the more we know about the surfaces, the materials of these pictures, the more sensitive we are inevitably going to get about their condition and their fragility. The Van Gogh Museum has said it won't lend its sunflowers ever again. It's only lent it, I think, probably 4 or 5 times in the last 30 years. But is this huge intensity, this volume of Van Gogh exhibitions around the world actually sustainable? Will you continue to send your Vase with Poppies? You would have sent it before it was a Van Gogh, but will you keep sending it now?
Well, I mean, among the pressures for any modern institution is you want to create access, and the idea of access has totally radically changed in the digital age. So, access can be the opportunity to see it in the gallery or the opportunity to make an appointment and see something in storage, but it can also be in the true curiosity that people have that will never come to Connecticut to see the picture.
Right.
And being able to put that up in the air for them virtually, digitally, has one level of access. But in this business, we will never be able to get past the fact that side-by-side physical comparison is a key to connoisseurship. I truly believe that. There is no end in sight for the art logistics businesses around the world, because people do see things differently in person, side by side, than they will ever see mediated by a machine.
That's true. And, you know, the DIA owns 5 paintings by Van Gogh, and we had tons of loan requests every year to lend the works. And we have to consider that these pieces are frail, and we have to preserve them for future generations. So we need to think when we lend a painting by Van Gogh, it's going to help understand better the work of the artist. Right. It's going to make a contribution to our history. So it's good to give access, but at the same time, there needs to be a point about understanding better Van Gogh.
Well, and we'd like to think about it. It also is of real public value to open up new conversations in new places. So maybe it's a story that's been told before in London, but it's a story that's never been told in, I don't know, Brisbane or what have you. And I'd just like to say one other thing. Salvador and I are, you know, we're the custodians, the public custodians of the public trust at 2 great museums with really fabulous things. Yeah. My institution is most often requested for Caravaggio. that's literally a monthly event that there's a Caravaggio letter in the mail to me. And I don't know about you, but he still outstrips Van Gogh in terms of exhibition fatigue out there.
We have the Caravaggio problem too.
Yeah.
Let's move on, because we could talk about the politics of loans and the possibilities of loans for a long time. But let's go to your gun, Martin, and or what it represents, because, of course, Van Gogh's work for the public is so intertwined with how they think about his life, the things they know about it, the things they don't know about it, the things they think they know about it. I mean, you've spent a lot of time, you've written biographies and you've delved into particular biographical periods. Do you ever worry that the public or the wider media has almost a prurient interest in Van Gogh's life at the expense of the work?
Yes, I don't think in a sense that matters, as long as we also focus on the art as well. I mean, people are interested in other people and they're interested in unusual people. So I wouldn't put people off being interested in Van Gogh's life. I mean, it is interesting and we enjoy reading biographies. But that's not all of the story, and we must look at the paintings. And yesterday I was at MoMA and talking to the curators there about Starry Night, which I'd written a book on. And they're now thinking of redisplaying their collection. And I said how important it was to make people actually look at the painting, not just take photographs in front of it, which has become a serious epidemic, I think, in New York. People don't look at the art.
Interestingly, the Van Gogh Museum itself, certainly 4 or 5 years ago, they stopped people taking photos in front of the pictures and created big reproductions that you could photograph yourself in front of. But I think that's also about visitor flow in that museum, because, of course, the intensity of the number of people who want to stand in front of every single painting and take a photo rather than use their eyes to look at it.
Yes, it was interesting. The Van Gogh Museum actually allowed photography, and then sort of I think it was 2 or 3 months later, reversed it because it was having such a damaging effect on the museum and the way people were looking at pictures.
You can selfie at our joint whenever you want.
But just as an extension, I mean, the other thing that people think about when they think of images rather than necessarily artworks. So they think of sunflower, they think of things that have been circulated everywhere. You can buy, made from the Amsterdam Museum or made from a number of other places, you can buy a skateboard with Starry Night on it. You can buy now 3D reproductions for 20,000 euros of some of the most important paintings in Amsterdam. You can buy armchairs covered in sunflowers and so on. Do you feel, I mean, how difficult is it to get past this just almost insanely sort of vociferous marketing of this artist?
Well, I think it's important that this market continues. It is obviously a sword with 2 edges. In a way, we are making the images of Van Gogh works very popular, but at the same time, it's inviting people to come to museums, and they have the curiosity to look at these works. So we're providing points of accessibility. People who don't know anything about art history or have no background in art at all. They know the name Van Gogh, they've seen the Starry Night, and they're going to see, oh, I saw it in the internet, I want to go and see it in the flesh. And that is an access point for them to go to museums and see other things. So it is a double-edged sword.
Axel Ruger, in fact, directed the Van Gogh Museum until basically now, moving to the RA. He told me that the average age of visitors to that museum is 32.
That's fantastic.
Which is astonishing compared to other museums dedicated to historical painting, after all.
Yeah.
I think we're going to open to some questions. I have many more, but I think it would be nice to let the audience ask a few questions too. The lady in the penultimate almost row, there's a microphone coming to you.
Hello. I have a question, because there's obviously been a lot of openness regarding Van Gogh, especially the Van Gogh Museum. Sorry, I'm Dutch, so I say Van Gogh. Very loud. Openness in terms of technical analysis of the works, openness in terms of publishing the letters, which I'm absolutely in favor of, and an exchange of information. I, for instance, work with an organization that tries to do similar things for the works of Modigliani. And there are a number of voices in this field that say there's a great danger to that. Don't disclose what you find in those technical studies. Don't publish things online in terms of provenance, because it's just giving a blueprint to fakers. What is your opinion on that?
Where should we I mean, it's a broader question about technical art history. Anything that you know people might want to use for nefarious means. But where do you sit on this as museum directors?
I think transparency is important, and we should put everything we know online. I think people are very interested in knowing how works of art are made. Recently, we hosted in Detroit a symposium showcasing the results of what a study that AAMD, the American Association of Museum Directors, did on the single visit to museums by students.
Yes.
And one of the outcomes of this study, one of the takeaways, was that students, when they come to the museum for only one time, they want to know how works of art are made. So that helps them with education, with their inspiration. They're coming back to the museum. Transparency in things, how are done, is important. I understand what the fear is, that people can take note, but it would be hard to fake a Van Gogh today, knowing all that we know, and having our equipment not detecting the forgery.
I would say that for different areas of the field, and particularly different artists with runaway prices, I think that the algebra that would go into it is how many of these works are still in private hands as opposed to in the public realm. How many times has the field tried to gather together something like a corpus and do those shows that used to be done in the 70s and 80s where you'd have 400 pictures, right? And at the end of the show, people would say, yeah, those 30, they didn't make it. Because the world convened and sat on it, chewed on it for some time. So I understand the trepidation, but someone like Van Gogh in 2019, I think we're doing our best.
Martin, ever been tempted to fake one?
It would be too difficult. I mean, Van Gogh discovery, we're talking about a discovery which emerges, which turns out to be fake. Authentic discoveries, there's probably one every 10 years, very, very rarely, and they're examined very thoroughly and would be examined by the Van Gogh Museum. I can't understand why giving out information would actually help a forger. I don't understand how that would actually work. And just one small point, the Van Gogh Museum is very open about its own pictures. It does research, and it has done research on the pictures in these American museums. It is rather discreet about the research it does on other pictures, so it's very open about its own.
I would add one thing. It's not only technical analysis what matters when we authenticate Van Gogh. You have provenance information, which is very important to really know whether a painting is authentic or not. And then there is the connoisseurship. Always. What our historians know about the art and how the art is developed. So.
Museum spoke. Oh, I'm sorry. And even they illustrated how some bad players used the letters with references to a work to fake provenance. Because we're not only talking about trying to fake works, people are trying to fake provenance as well. So, I mean, I'm completely on your side. I'm trying to maybe shut down the voices for other artists where people say, oh, no, we shouldn't be speaking about that. We shouldn't revisit those works. We shouldn't show those works. And I am actually very much in favor for the discussion. And like what you said, we put the pictures together at a time maybe that you weren't even sure that the other picture was actually an authentic Van Gogh, and say, let's look at these two together and let's exchange information. Let's exchange information in terms of the technical analysis, where these works came from. So I'm happy to hear that you approve. But I just want to point out, people are not just trying to fake physically works, they're trying to fake provenance as well.
To come with them. Are there any other questions? There's certainly a question on the front row.
You've been describing the media frenzy with the discovery and reappearance of this work, and in recent years we've had the same with a well-known old master painting. Do you think this frenzy is justified on terms of the artistic and historical importance of either object?
Oh, I don't think they're correlated at all. I think that public fascination is public fascination. And we don't think of our institution as getting its self-worth from Instagram hits. But how you can, like as Salvador said, how you can turn that fascination, that curiosity, and that accessibility of a name like this. I mean, I said to Martin before the panel, who is it now? It's Picasso, Van Gogh, Warhol, maybe Michelangelo, that instantly becomes, New York Post worthy. And no offense to the New York Post, but that sense of capturing the public fascination, it's what you do with it afterwards.
It's something to be optimistic about, isn't it? Yeah. Finding a new work that adds to the canon of an artist and our knowledge of one particular period that is understudied in his career. The difference, of course, is that your work won't find itself part of the largest auction house marketing campaign ever made. It never needs to be harnessed, that frenzy, in order to create some price for it or something. Yeah. The price is having a label and what it might add to, or the value is what it might add to scholarship in the future. Yeah,
and this is a transitional work at a key moment in his career that we're now focusing in on. And I think the fact that we're more serious about 1886 now in Paris period is really important. Salvador and I are working on a project together about Artemisia Gentileschi. We bought a beautiful self-portrait as a ludist 5 years ago, and we're finally going to do the great show together about her in America.
That's right.
And I wouldn't say that our Artemisia is the ne plus ultra of her work either, but it's key to understanding what she was doing in Florence at a precise moment in time in her career.
Artemisia for another day. There's a question at the back of the audience.
How long will the Wadsworth Van Gogh be on display before it goes on loan?
Hey, Simon.
Hi, Tom. Good to see you.
Our picture will be lent to a show at the Museo Barberini in Potsdam in the autumn. I think it opens in October. It's actually reassembling the still lives of Van Gogh in a serious way, and there'll be a whole section of the show dedicated to these flower pictures made in 1886.
We are lending to our vase with carnations.
I take one more question just in the third row here.
Yeah, that puts a lot of pressure on my question, doesn't it? So I want to switch back to the gun for a second, because that's sort of part and parcel of a current dispute as to whether Van Gogh committed suicide or whether he was accidentally or whatever killed, shot by these local boys. I'm curious, Martin, whether you have a particular view on that and can elaborate.
Yes, I definitely do have a view, and my view is that it was suicide. I mean, the main source that's suggesting that it was not suicide was the biography published by Nefer and Smith about 6 or 7 years ago in America, which argued that it was murder or manslaughter. I'm convinced that it was suicide, and the main reason for me is simple. Everyone believed it was suicide at the time. His brother Theo believed it. Dr. Gachet, who treated him, believed it. Ravu, who ran the inn, believed it. And suicide at that time was very much frowned upon, and the church in Auvers would not allow their hearse to be used to carry his body to the cemetery. That's just one sign of how suicide was regarded. Why would his family and friends, if he'd been murdered, not have raised this as an issue? I think the evidence for manslaughter and murder is very slight. And I suspect that this biography that was published here put forward this new theory, partly in order to gain exposure, but it really has come into mainstream thinking now, and I think it's distorting our view of Van Gogh. I mean, he obviously had serious mental problems, and he had crises, and it was during one of these crises that he decided to end his life. It would be a very different story if he'd been shot by someone else. So it was not murder, it was suicide.
It would be rather depressing for us to end on that note. So I'm going to just ask one quick fire question to round us off. If every generation needs its own biopic of Van Gogh, who is the better Van Gogh for you three along the line? Willem Dafoe or Kirk Douglas?
I have to admit I haven't seen either movie. Kirk Douglas, no question.
Neither.
Well, Tom Lohman, Salvador Salort-Pons, and Martin Bailey, thank you very much for this very illuminating discussion.
Thanks to you again for being here with us. Please come back and visit after you've seen the fair, or of course you are here to see the fair, but we'd love to have you come back and visit us. And thank you, Tom, I have to say, for a terrific job of moderating this panel also.
Thank you.
As always, well researched. Thanks. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. See you soon.